The crowd gasped. But before I even wiped the frosting from my eyes, the most ruthless real estate tycoon on the East Coast jumped from the VIP table, pointed a shaking finger at him, and shouted, "Are you out of your mind? He is a billionaire!" Welcome to Father's Vengeance Chronicles. Before we continue with today's story, please take a moment to support us by giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us and gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories every single day. We would also love to hear your thoughts. Please share your feelings, opinions, or reactions in the comments below, and don't forget to include the hashtag #FathersVengeanceChronicles. Thank you so much for being here, for listening, and for becoming a valued part of our storytelling community. The fiancé turned as pale as a ghost. He did not know that just 3 hours earlier I had quietly bought out every single dime of his massive secret debt. If you want to know how a proud father took down a fraud, tell me where you are watching from in the comments and keep listening. I downshifted the heavy manual transmission of my rusted 2005 Ford F-150. The old engine groaned a familiar, comforting sound as I navigated the steep, perfectly manicured, winding driveway of a lavish Hamptons estate. My hands gripping the worn steering wheel were thick, weathered, and heavily calloused. They were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years building a global shipping and commercial real estate empire, starting with absolutely nothing but a single rusty tugboat on the freezing docks of New York. I did not inherit my wealth. I bled for it. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and eventually my marriage to build a fortress of security for my family. And yet I never cared to flaunt it. I still drove my old truck. I still polished my own boots. Sitting on the cracked leather passenger seat beside me was the wedding invitation. It was heavy, printed on excessively expensive cardstock with raised gold foil lettering. It was an invitation to the wedding of my only child, my daughter Brooke. We had been deeply distant for the past 15 years, ever since my bitter divorce from her mother, Patricia. Patricia was a woman who loved the idea of wealth and high society far more than she ever loved the man who worked day and night to provide it. When we split, she poisoned my daughter's mind against me, painting me as a work-obsessed mechanic who cared more about cargo ships than his own family. Tucked inside that elegant, shimmering envelope was a small, yellow, sticky note. It was not a message of love or excitement from my daughter. It was a hastily scribbled note from Patricia. It read, "Try to look decent, Harrison. Stand in the back." I parked my beaten-up truck near the far edge of the lot, deliberately keeping it out of the way, nestled in the shadows between gleaming Porsches, imported Mercedes, and chauffeur-driven luxury SUVs. I turned off the engine and let the silence wash over me for a brief moment. I stepped out of the truck, taking a slow breath of the salty ocean air, and smoothed down the lapels of my suit. It was a clean, well-pressed gray suit from Sears that I had bought 15 years ago. My boots were old steel-toed mechanic boots. I had polished them until they shined, but they were still deeply scuffed at the toes from years of walking on cargo ship decks. They were comfortable, and more importantly, they grounded me. They reminded me of exactly who I was and where I came from. I walked slowly toward the grand, towering entrance of the estate. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts were rushing frantically to open doors for women draped in designer gowns and men strutting in tailored tuxedos. The wealth on display was deafening. But to a man who truly has money, this kind of loud, desperate flaunting always looks like a performance. As I approached the sweeping stone steps, a younger man stepped directly into my path, completely blocking my way. He was impeccably dressed in a custom-fitted navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His hair was slicked back perfectly, and his posture practically radiated unearned arrogance. This was Trent Caldwell, the man my daughter was about to marry. I had never formally met him thanks to Patricia keeping me completely isolated from Brooke's adult life, but I knew his face from the brief photographs I had seen online. Trent stopped and looked me up and down. His eyes scanned my outdated simple suit and immediately darted down to my scuffed mechanic boots. A look of profound disgust washed over his face as if I had tracked mud into his personal kingdom. He sneered, letting out a short, mocking sigh. Without a single word of greeting or basic human decency, he reached into his tailored pocket, pulled out a set of keys with a heavy leather keychain, and shoved them aggressively toward my chest. "Here, take the keys to my car," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "And be careful with the clutch. It is worth more than your life. Make sure you park it near the front so my guests can see it." I did not reach for the keys. I kept my hands resting quietly at my sides. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, and looked him directly in the eye. I let the heavy silence stretch between us for a long moment, watching the irritation build on his polished face when I refused to obey his command. "I am not the valet," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and steady, carrying the weight of a man who routinely negotiates with ruthless union bosses and international tycoons. "My name is Harrison Cole. I am Brooke's father." The keys slipped from his outstretched hand and clattered loudly onto the stone driveway. For a split second, the arrogant smirk completely vanished from Trent's face. He blinked clearly, caught off guard, staring at me as if I were an unwanted stray dog that had somehow wandered into a palace. But the shock did not last long. Within seconds, his fake, polished smile returned to his face, though it was tight, forced, and entirely devoid of any real warmth. "Right," he chuckled nervously, bending down quickly to snatch his keys off the cold stone. "Brooke mentioned you might actually show up. I just did not expect you to look so authentic." He did not offer his hand to shake. He did not say it was a pleasure to meet the man who gave life to his future bride. Instead, he turned his head and snapped his fingers loudly at a security guard standing near the heavy wooden doors. The guard immediately jogged over, looking tense. "Keep a close eye on the old man," Trent ordered, not even bothering to lower his voice to spare my feelings. "Make sure he does not wander into the VIP lounge or bother the catering staff for free food. We have some very important, very wealthy investors arriving soon, and we cannot afford any embarrassing distractions." The security guard nodded, giving me a wary, apologetic look. Trent turned his back to me completely and walked away to greet a group of wealthy-looking guests, laughing loudly and slapping them on the back as if I simply did not exist. I stood there on the steps, the cold ocean breeze blowing against my face. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I just watched him walk away. My gut told me everything I needed to know in that single brief interaction. A man who treats a stranger with that much contempt simply because he believes they have no money is a man who hides a very dark, very fragile reality behind his expensive suit. I reached into my pocket and felt the smooth surface of my encrypted satellite phone. The wedding weekend had barely begun, but I already knew that Trent Caldwell had made the biggest mistake of his life. The game was in motion. The grand dining hall of the estate was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in imported silk. Elaborate floral centerpieces towered above the guests, dripping with rare orchids that cost more than a modest family's monthly grocery bill. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the clinking of champagne flutes and the boastful laughter of the coastal elite. It was the hollow theatrical display of wealth Patricia always craved. I found my assigned seat. It was a small, unsteady chair tucked away in the furthest corner of the cavernous room, positioned directly next to the swinging metal doors of the kitchen. Every few minutes, a waiter burst through those doors, bringing a rush of hot air and the chaotic clatter of crashing plates. I was seated as far away from Brooke and the main wedding party as physically possible. They intentionally placed me in the shadows, hoping I would remain unseen. It was a deliberate insult calculated to make me feel profoundly unwelcome. I pulled out my chair and sat quietly, resting my calloused hands on my knees. I did not complain to the staff. A man who truly knows his own worth never needs to demand a seat at the center of the room. I watched the elite guests mingle. To them, I was just an old man in a dated suit and scuffed boots, an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise flawless aesthetic canvas. Soon Trent's family made their grand entrance. They took their places at the head tables, but not before taking deliberate detours past my dark corner. Trent's mother, dripping in ostentatious jewelry, glanced at my boots and let out a sharp gasp. She leaned toward her sister and whispered loudly, "Can you believe he wore those hideous work boots to a formal dinner? It is absolutely disgraceful. Trent is kind to even allow that riffraff inside the building. They spoke about me as if I were deaf, or simply too insignificant to comprehend their cruelty." I felt a familiar, steady calm settle over my mind. In my 40 years of building a global logistics empire from nothing, I had faced down ruthless international cartel bosses and survived. The petty snickering of these sheltered socialites meant absolutely nothing to me. I took a slow sip of water. Fools always laugh the loudest right before the ground collapses beneath their feet. My ex-wife, Patricia, made her way across the room. She wore a sleek designer gown, her face frozen in a polite smile. But as she approached my table, that smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened glare. She stopped beside my chair, her posture rigid with an old resentment. "I told you to stand in the back, Harrison," she said, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "But you just had to come inside and ruin the aesthetic. You look like a homeless person who wandered in off the street. I am only here for my daughter." Before I could even respond to her, she reached into her expensive silver clutch. She pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill. With an aggressive motion, she shoved the money forcefully into the front breast pocket of my old Sears suit. She patted the pocket twice, a condescending gesture that made my jaw tighten. "Take that money," she whispered maliciously. "Use it for gas on your way back to whatever trailer park you currently live in right now. Leave early tomorrow. We do not need your poverty dragging down the wedding photos." She turned on her heels and marched back toward the bright lights. She was expecting me to cause a scene so she could justify kicking me out entirely. I did not give her the satisfaction. I calmly reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the folded bill. I smoothed out the sharp creases on the table. Just then, a young busboy rushed out from the swinging kitchen doors. He looked no older than 19, carrying a massive tray of dirty dishes, his arms trembling under the immense weight. He looked exhausted, stressed, and entirely invisible to the wealthy guests laughing around him. I remembered what it felt like to be that boy. I remembered working consecutive double shifts at the freezing shipping docks of New York Harbor. My hands bleeding just trying to scrape together enough money to keep the heat running. In those days, a single bill could mean the difference between eating and starving. True wealth is not found in an offshore bank account. It is found in knowing the grueling value of hard labor. I never forgot where I came from. As the young busboy rushed past my table, I quietly slid the crisp $100 bill directly under the edge of his tray. He stopped looking down at the money in absolute shock. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with gratitude. I simply gave him a small nod and put a finger to my lips. He mouthed a silent thank you and hurried back into the chaotic kitchen. With that matter settled, I turned my attention toward the center of the room. Trent was holding court at the main table, completely surrounded by an eager audience. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He signaled aggressively to the waitstaff, demanding they bring over 3 more bottles of vintage champagne. Those bottles cost $1,000 apiece. He poured the champagne freely, laughing loudly, playing the role of the careless, untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager to absolute perfection. But a man who has spent decades analyzing human behavior sees things that ordinary people miss entirely. I watched Trent very closely. My eyes tracked his every movement, stripping away the shiny, expensive armor of his performance. The head waiter approached Trent from behind, leaning down to discreetly present a leather-bound checkbook containing the preliminary charges for the rehearsal dinner. Trent kept the wide, arrogant smile plastered on his face for his audience. But as he opened the leather booklet and glanced down at the final total, I saw it. It was a microscopic reaction, but to my trained eyes, it was as loud as a gunshot. The muscles along Trent's jawline tightened violently. The color drained slightly from his cheeks. His hand trembled just a fraction of an inch before he gripped the glass harder to compensate. He gave a quick, panicked glance around the room, the look of a hunted animal desperately searching for an exit. He quickly signed the receipt, shoving the booklet back at the waiter. With unnecessary force, his fake smile returning a second too late. I sat right back in my wobbly, uncomfortable chair by the kitchen doors, the deafening noise of the upscale party slowly fading into the background. My gut instinct flared loud, sharp, and undeniable. The lavish theatrical spending, the completely unearned aggressive arrogance, the sheer terror in his eyes when faced with a simple restaurant bill. This boy was not a billionaire. This boy was rapidly drowning. And my only daughter was about to tie herself permanently to his doomed sinking ship. I waited until Trent was momentarily distracted by a group of fawning bridesmaids before I finally made my move. I stood up from my unsteady chair by the kitchen doors and navigated through the sea of silk dresses and tailored tuxedos. I was looking for my daughter. I spotted Brooke standing near a towering floral arrangement of white orchids. She looked stunning in her elegant evening gown, but there was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a stiffness that did not belong on a bride the night before her wedding. I approached her slowly, my heavy boots making a soft thud against the polished hardwood floor. When she saw me, her posture stiffened even more. She offered a quick, nervous glance over my shoulder, checking to see if anyone important was watching us. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "You should probably stay seated. Trent's parents are circulating." "I just wanted to give you this," I replied gently, keeping my voice entirely steady despite the cold reception. I reached into the deep pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden jewelry box. It was made from rich mahogany, the exact same wood I had salvaged from the very first commercial cargo ship I ever purchased decades ago. I had spent the last 3 weeks sanding it by hand in my private workshop, polishing the surface until the beautiful grain shined like glass. I had delicately engraved her initials on the heavy lid, just like I used to carve her name into the little wooden blocks she played with as a child, before the bitter divorce tore our daily lives apart. I held the small box out to her. "I made it for you, to keep your new ring safe." Brooke stared down at the box. For a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine unbridled warmth crossed her face. She remembered. But the warmth was instantly replaced by a massive wave of embarrassment. Her eyes darted around the crowded room again in sheer panic. Instead of opening it to appreciate the craftsmanship, she quickly snatched the box from my hands and tried to shove it deep into her small designer clutch. It did not fit. She fumbled with it awkwardly, her cheeks flushing bright red with shame. "Thank you, Dad," she mumbled quickly, looking directly down at the floor. "I will put it away later. Just please go sit down before Trent sees us together." It was entirely too late. Heavy, confident footsteps approached from behind me. A thick, suffocating cloud of expensive designer cologne announced Trent Caldwell's arrival before he even opened his mouth to speak. "What do we have here?" Trent asked loudly, his booming voice cutting through the soft background music. He stepped aggressively between Brooke and me, his cold eyes locked firmly on the mahogany box still clutched in her trembling hands. "It is absolutely nothing," Brooke stammered, completely shrinking under his intense, controlling gaze. "Just a very small gift from my father." Trent did not ask for permission. He reached out and aggressively snatched the wooden box right out of her hands. He held it up to the chandelier light, inspecting it with exaggerated, mocking scrutiny. A cruel, patronizing smile spread slowly across his perfectly shaved face. "Did you make this yourself?" Old Man Trent asked, turning the box over carelessly in his hands. "It looks like something you would find discarded at a cheap flea market or a dusty garage sale." I kept my facial expression entirely neutral, my hands folded calmly and patiently in front of me. "I carved it from solid mahogany. It is a family tradition." Trent let out a loud, highly theatrical laugh that intentionally drew the attention of several nearby wealthy guests. A tradition, he mocked, shaking his head slowly in fake pity. "Well, Brooke and I have much better traditions now. Traditions that come in beautiful little blue boxes from Tiffany & Co. We do not really have room in our stunning new penthouse for basic homemade arts and crafts." Brooke looked away, utterly unable to meet my eyes. She did not defend me. She did not ask for the box back. She simply stood there in passive silence, absolutely terrified of upsetting the man she believed was her wealthy savior. Trent turned toward a passing waiter who was carrying a tray of fresh drinks. Trent grabbed a heavy crystal glass filled with dark, expensive whiskey and melting ice. He took a long, arrogant sip, then looked back at me with a smirk full of pure malice. Without breaking eye contact for even a single second, he placed the small mahogany box directly onto a nearby cocktail table. Then, with deliberate and profound disrespect, he slammed his wet, sweating whiskey glass directly onto the intricately carved lid. "It makes a fantastic coaster, though," Trent said, a vicious, triumphant glint in his eye. "Thanks for the little contribution, Harrison. Now, if you will excuse us, we have actual guests to entertain tonight." The condensation from the glass immediately began to pool on the polished wood, threatening to ruin the countless hours of labor I had poured into it. Every basic human instinct in my body, every ounce of raw power I commanded, as a man who routinely ruled massive boardrooms and ruthlessly crushed hostile corporate takeovers, screamed at me to grab him by his custom-tailored collar and absolutely destroy his fake world right then and there. But I held back. A predator never strikes when the prey is just testing the waters. I needed to let him feel completely invincible. I took a slow, measured breath, preparing to simply remove the heavy glass and walk away. But before I could even extend my hand, the elegant atmosphere in the room abruptly shifted. The sudden disruption did not come from me. A man forcefully shoved his way past the elegant floral arrangements and marched directly toward our small table. He was certainly not an invited guest. He wore a cheap, heavily scuffed leather jacket over a dark, wrinkled t-shirt. His face was deeply weathered, his nose was slightly crooked, and his dark eyes carried the cold, completely dead stare of a man who collected dangerous debts for a living. He completely ignored the surrounding elite socialites and walked straight up behind Trent. Without speaking a single word, the man in the leather jacket reached out and forcefully grabbed Trent's tailored shoulder. His grip was brutal. Trent spun around quickly, his mouth open wide to shout an insult, entirely ready to unleash his arrogant fury on whoever dared to touch him. But the exact moment Trent's eyes locked onto the man's face, his arrogant mask shattered into a million tiny pieces. The color drained entirely from Trent's face, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. His jaw trembled. The booming voice he had used to humiliate me just seconds ago completely evaporated into thin, empty air. He was speechless. The man quickly pushed Trent forward. Trent stumbled slightly, his eyes wide with absolute terror, as the stranger forced him aggressively into a very dark, completely empty hallway right behind us. I watched the door swing shut behind them, cutting off the light from the narrow hallway. The live music continued to play a soft jazz melody that felt detached from the sudden violence I had just witnessed. Nobody else in the room seemed to have noticed a single thing. The wealthy guests continued to clink their champagne flutes and laugh loudly, completely oblivious to the fact that the groom had just been manhandled by a thug in a leather jacket. I turned my attention back to Brooke. She was standing stiffly by the floral arrangement, nervously smoothing out the wrinkles on her gown. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes remained fixed on the hardwood floor. She had seen the exchange, yet she tried desperately to pretend that nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. I took a slow step toward her, keeping my voice low and calm so as not to startle her. I asked her who that aggressive man was, and why he had grabbed Trent with such brutal force. Brooke forced a bright, artificial smile onto her face before turning to look at me. When she finally met my gaze, her eyes were fiercely defensive, guarded by years of the status-obsessed conditioning her mother had instilled in her. She let out a short, dismissive laugh and waved her hand in the air. "Oh, that is just a frustrated contractor," she said smoothly, reciting the lie with the rehearsed precision sought of someone fed a specific script. "Trent manages a $50 million hedge fund, Dad. He is a very important man in the financial district. People are constantly begging him for investments. and sometimes they get a little too desperate when he firmly rejects their business proposals. I listened to her words in absolute silence. A $50 million hedge fund manager does not get shoved into dark hallways by frustrated contractors. A powerful man with $50 million has a dedicated security detail, or at least the confidence to stand his ground in public. Trent had folded like a cheap paper towel, his eyes screaming in primal terror. But Brooke desperately wanted to believe it, to protect her fragile fantasy. She tilted her chin upward, taking on that familiar, arrogant stance Patricia had perfected. Trent is dealing with incredibly high stakes all the time, she continued, her voice taking on a patronizing edge. It is a completely different world from what you are used to, Dad. He carries a massive amount of stress because he is responsible for building a huge empire for our future. Before I could press her further on the glaring inconsistencies of her story, Brooke proudly lifted her left hand. She extended her delicate fingers outward deliberately, catching the bright light from the crystal chandelier above us. Resting heavily on her ring finger was an ostentatious stone. It was easily 3 carats set in a thick platinum band that looked cumbersome. She stared at the stone with a look of absolute reverence, treating it not as a meaningful symbol of enduring love, but as a shiny trophy of her newly elevated social status. Trent had it custom-made just for me, she said, her voice dripping with a smug sense of superiority. He wanted to make sure I had the absolute best. He told me that a woman of my caliber deserves a diamond that immediately commands respect the second she walks into any room. I looked from the massive ring up to my daughter's beautiful face. The harsh, deeply judgmental glare she gave me was a perfect mirror image of her mother. Then she delivered the calculated blow. He is providing a glorious life you never could, Dad, she said coldly. A life where I never have to worry about smelling like motor oil or settling for second best. You could learn a lot about success from a man like him. I swallowed the bitter pain that rose sharply in my throat. Hearing your own child speak to you with such profound contempt is a unique kind of agony. It feels like a physical weight forcefully pressing down on your chest. I had spent 40 years deliberately sacrificing my own comfort, working grueling 80-hour weeks, building a global shipping network from scratch, so that she would never have to know the crushing grip of poverty. And yet here she stood, completely convinced that my worn mechanic boots were a shameful symbol of failure, rather than the very foundation of her highly privileged existence. I did not raise my voice in anger. I did not angrily defend my hidden bank account. Instead, I focused my attention entirely on the stone sitting proudly on her left hand. "May I see it?" I asked quietly, keeping my tone perfectly mild and supportive. Brooke hesitated for a brief moment, clearly surprised by my non-confrontational reactions to her harsh insult. She reluctantly held her hand a few inches closer to my face, keeping her arm rigid. I leaned in closely, narrowing my eyes as I examined the large stone under the unforgiving glow of the chandelier. In the late 1990s, my international shipping company had secured a massive contract to transport raw diamonds directly from South Africa to the most elite jewelers in the United States. For 5 solid years, I personally oversaw the complex logistics of those multi-million-dollar shipments. I spent countless hours sitting quietly in secure vaults alongside master gemologists, learning exactly how to identify the unmistakable characteristics of a genuine diamond. I learned about the internal fire, the specific way a real diamond aggressively bends and refracts light, sending brilliant flashes of deep color radiating from its solid core. I stared intensely at the massive stone on Brooke's finger. It was undeniably huge, cut with mathematical symmetry and completely flawless to the untrained eye. But as the chandelier light hit the polished facets, my trained instincts immediately caught the glaring imperfection. The light refraction was entirely wrong. Instead of the fierce brilliance of a genuine diamond, the light bouncing off the large stone was flat, glassy, and lifeless. It lacked the necessary internal fire. It was incredibly shiny, yes, but it was completely hollow inside. It was a well-cut piece of cubic zirconia, but it was absolutely fake. My heart sank deeply into my chest, heavy with terrible realization. The truth hit me with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. My beautiful daughter was not just marrying an arrogant, deeply unpleasant man. She was tying her entire life and her future to a desperate, dangerous fraud. A man who constantly bragged to crowds about a $50 million hedge fund, but could not afford a genuine basic diamond for his beautiful bride. A man who allowed himself to be physically threatened and shoved by a street-level debt collector in the middle of a highly secure Hamptons estate. The fake ring, the terror in his eyes, the aggressive bravado designed to mask his overwhelming panic. It was all a carefully constructed, fragile house of cards, built entirely on desperate lies. And Brooke was standing right in the center of it. I must act now. I gently released Brooke's hand, letting her step back into the safety of her constructed illusion. She smoothed down her silk gown, gave me a defensive nod, and quickly disappeared into the sea of tailored tuxedos. I stood alone near the floral arrangements, letting the reality wash over me. My only daughter was marching into a burning building, and she was fiercely defending the arsonist who struck the match. I turned slowly and walked back to my isolated chair near the swinging kitchen doors. The string quartet had stopped playing, their melodies replaced by the sharp sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute. The low hum of elite conversation faded into an expectant silence. At the front of the grand hall, perfectly illuminated under the largest chandelier, stood Trent Caldwell. He held a glass of vintage champagne in one hand and a wireless microphone in the other. He radiated a toxic, manufactured confidence that only a desperate man could produce. He waited for the room to fall silent, savoring the absolute attention of the wealthy guests. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Trent began, his voice booming through the speakers with a practiced cadence. "Tomorrow, I marry the most beautiful woman in the world. But tonight, I want to talk about legacy. I want to talk about what it means to build an empire from the ground up, to be a man who shapes the future rather than simply existing in it." He paced back and forth across the stage, making deliberate eye contact with the most affluent investors seated at the front tables. "Some of you know that my hedge fund has been aggressively pursuing a monumental commercial acquisition for the past 6 months," Trent continued. "It has been a grueling war of attrition against some of the oldest money in this city. But I am incredibly proud to announce tonight, in front of my future bride and my closest allies, that we have finally closed the deal." The room erupted into eager applause. Patricia beamed with pride, clapping enthusiastically from the front row. Trent held up his hand to quiet them down, a smug smile stretching across his face. "We just secured the primary commercial rights to the Sterling Tower on Madison Avenue," he declared boldly, his chest puffed out. 50 stories of premium untouched Manhattan real estate. It is an absolute crown jewel, and it is officially ours." The applause swelled again, louder this time. Trent waited, letting the adulation feed his fragile ego. Then his eyes scanned the room. His gaze bypassed the billionaires, the socialites, and his beaming fiancée. His eyes traveled all the way to the dark, isolated corner by the kitchen doors. His gaze locked directly onto me. The microphone picked up his soft, mocking chuckle. "You know, building a legacy requires a certain kind of ruthless evolution," Trent said, his tone dropping into a condescending drawl. "It requires leaving the old ways behind." I look around this room and I see the absolute future, but I am also reminded of the pathetic past. Some men, he paused dramatically, gesturing in my direction with his champagne flute. Some men work until they are 70 years old just to afford a rusted pickup truck and a cheap suit. The silence in the room became heavy. They break their backs for decades. Trent continued, his voice dripping with venomous cruelty, convinced that blind, mindless labor will somehow lead to greatness. But true greatness is not earned by sweating in the dirt like a peasant. I made my first million at 25. I am acquiring Manhattan skyscrapers before I turn 35. Cheers to rapid evolution, and cheers to leaving the dinosaurs exactly where they belong, buried deeply in the past. He raised his glass high into the air. A few of his groomsmen snickered loudly, turning to stare directly at me in my dark corner. Patricia let out a short, mocking laugh, raising her crystal glass in enthusiastic agreement. The cruelty in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket of elitist contempt, directed entirely at a man they believed to be a pathetic failure. I looked over at Brooke. She was staring down at her lap, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. She did not stand up. She did not defend the man who had worked multiple freezing shifts at the docks to pay for her childhood medical bills. She simply accepted my public humiliation as the cost of admission into Trent's imaginary kingdom. I did not shift in my uncomfortable seat. I did not look away, nor did I show a single ounce of embarrassment or anger. I calmly reached out, picked up my simple glass of ice water, and took a slow, highly deliberate sip. The cold water slid smoothly down my throat, perfectly, matching the absolute freezing ice that had just settled permanently into my veins. Trent Caldwell was not a master of the financial universe. He was a deeply stupid, incredibly reckless child, playing a highly dangerous game he did not remotely understand. I did not need to run a corporate background check to know he was lying about his massive commercial acquisition. I did not need my aggressive legal team to verify the current operational status of the Sterling Tower on Madison Avenue. I knew exactly who owned that 50-story building. I bought the Sterling Tower 12 years ago during a massive, devastating market downturn. I completely gutted the entire structure, spent $60 million renovating the commercial infrastructure, and placed it permanently inside a private, heavily guarded holding trust strictly under the umbrella of Cole Enterprises. I am the sole absolute owner of the Sterling Tower. There are no outside investors. There is no hedge fund consortium involved. And there is absolutely no active negotiation for its commercial rights with anyone, let alone a petty fraud like Trent Caldwell. Trent had simply picked the most impressive, highly visible building he could think of to desperately impress a room full of wealthy strangers. He was completely unaware that the actual billionaire owner of that exact building was currently sitting at the absolute worst table in the room, wearing a 15-year-old suit and steel-toed mechanic boots. The lie was so unbelievably massive, so easily verifiable to anyone with actual corporate power, that it firmly confirmed my darkest, most troubling suspicions. The scattered puzzle pieces rapidly snapped together perfectly in my mind. Trent was completely drowning in highly dangerous debt. He had a violent street-level debt collector aggressively crashing an exclusive wedding rehearsal. He had pawned a priceless, sentimental family heirloom just to buy a fake cubic zirconia. And now he was publicly fabricating multi-million-dollar real estate deals to desperately project a fragile illusion of extreme wealth. He was not just lying to my daughter. He was lying to his investors, his supposed friends, and whatever violent criminal element he had foolishly borrowed millions from. The dominoes were starting to fall rapidly, and Trent was dancing wildly at the very bottom of the chain, entirely oblivious to the absolute destruction heading his way. He took another eager sip of his $1,000 champagne, basking blindly in the warm glow of a mighty kingdom he did not own. I set my water glass down firmly on the table. The paternal anger that had briefly flared inside me completely vanished, replaced by the terrifying clinical focus of an apex corporate predator calmly preparing to dismantle its prey. Let him drink his expensive champagne. Let him enjoy his unearned applause. Let him believe he had successfully humiliated the old clueless mechanic in front of the entire coastal elite. Tomorrow, the massive bill would finally come due, and I was going to collect every single penny. As the applause for his fabricated achievement finally began to die down, Trent raised his hand to quiet the room. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek, expensive smartphone. He looked at the blank screen with exaggerated importance, furrowing his brow, as if he had just received an incredibly urgent message that demanded his immediate attention. He leaned toward Brooke, whispering something in her ear, and then addressed his captivated audience one more time. "I am terribly sorry to interrupt the celebration," Trent announced, his voice projecting a fake sense of deep regret. "But when duty calls, a man has to answer." I have a scheduled conference call with a rather influential senator regarding some upcoming financial legislation on Wall Street. It is an absolute nuisance, I know, but these elite political figures simply do not understand the concept of a weekend off. Please enjoy the caviar and keep the champagne flowing. I will be back in just a moment. The guests murmured in absolute awe, clearly impressed by his supposed political connections. Patricia nodded approvingly, her eyes shining with greed as she looked at her future son-in-law. Trent gave Brooke a quick, practiced kiss on the cheek, straightened his expensive tie, and turned to leave the dining hall. But I noticed something that the room full of admiring socialites completely missed. As Trent turned his back to the crowd and walked briskly toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the garden, his broad shoulders instantly slumped. The confident, arrogant swagger evaporated with every single step he took away from the bright lights. His breathing grew shallow, and his hands swinging by his sides were clenched tightly into fists. A man taking a routine call with a political ally walks with pride. A man walking to the gallows walks exactly like Trent Caldwell was walking right now. I waited exactly 30 seconds before I pushed my unsteady chair back from the table. Nobody paid any attention to the old mechanic slipping quietly out through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen staff was too busy plating the next course to notice me navigating through the narrow service hallway that led directly to the back gardens of the estate. The night air was crisp, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the Atlantic Ocean. The sprawling garden was a maze of perfectly trimmed hedges, marble statues, and bubbling stone fountains, all illuminated by soft, ambient landscape lighting. It was a beautiful, serene setting, but tonight it felt like a hunting ground. I stepped carefully onto the cobblestone path, the thick rubber soles of my old work boots absorbing the sound of my footsteps. I moved slowly, keeping to the deep shadows cast by the towering oak trees. I did not have to search for very long. I could hear the frantic crunching of gravel coming from a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the edge of the property line. I positioned myself quietly behind a thick row of tall, manicured bushes. From my hidden vantage point, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the groom. Trent was completely alone, but he was not holding the sleek, expensive smartphone he had flashed inside the dining hall. Instead, he was aggressively gripping a cheap, disposable plastic burner phone. His hands were shaking violently as he punched in a number. The transformation in his demeanor was genuinely shocking. The smooth, untouchable billionaire persona was completely gone. In its place stood a terrified, desperate child. Sweat glistened on his forehead, reflecting the pale moonlight. He tugged frantically at the collar of his custom suit, as if it were suddenly choking him. He paced back and forth across the gravel path, his chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. He lifted the cheap plastic phone to his ear, his entire body tense and rigid. When the person on the other end answered, Trent did not speak with the commanding authority of a hedge fund manager. He spoke with the high, wavering pitch of a man begging for his very life. "Listen to me, you have to listen to me," Trent pleaded, his voice cracking with absolute desperation. "I know what the deadline was, but you cannot do this tonight. Not tonight. I am literally standing at my rehearsal dinner right now. The wedding is tomorrow. You just need to give me a little more time. I swear on my life I have everything completely under control." There was a brief silence as the person on the other end spoke. Whatever was said made Trent flinch as if he had been physically struck. He squeezed his eyes shut and ran his trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive look. "I am not trying to avoid you," Trent hissed, his tone dropping into a frantic, hushed whisper. "I am telling you the absolute truth. I just need 48 more hours. That is all I am asking for. 48 hours. Once I marry her tomorrow afternoon, the marital trust fund automatically unlocks. Her grandfather left her a massive account, and I will have full legal access to every single penny as her husband. You will get your $4 million back. I will even add a massive interest payment for the delay. Just please do not send anyone else to the venue. You are going to ruin everything if you spook her family." Another heavy silence followed. Trent listened to the final chilling verdict from his ruthless creditor. He let out a desperate, defeated gasp. Please do not do that, Trent begged, tears of pure terror welling up in his eyes. I will have the 4 million by Monday morning. I promise you. Just let me marry the girl. The line went dead. Trent stared at the cheap burner phone in absolute horror. A raw, guttural sound of frustration tore from his throat. He violently hurled the plastic device against the brick wall of the estate, shattering it into pieces. He then kicked a heavy landscaping stone with all his might, cursing loudly into the empty night air. He bent over, resting his hands on his knees, taking deep, shaky breaths as he tried to compose his shattered facade. I stood perfectly still behind the thick hedges enveloped in the cold shadows. The blazing siren of my gut feeling had just been proven entirely correct. Trent was not a successful businessman. He was a monumental fraud who owed $4 million to incredibly dangerous people. He was using my daughter, planning to drain her protective trust fund the very second the ink dried on their marriage certificate. He viewed Brooke as nothing more than a convenient, wealthy sacrifice to save his own miserable life. I slowly turned away from the alcove and walked silently back toward the kitchen doors. I did not need to hear another word. The time for gathering simple clues was completely over. It was time to quietly initiate the secret action to protect my only daughter. I would burn his fake empire to the ground and ensure he never ever threatened my family again. The ruthless corporate predator was now fully awake. I slipped silently back through the garden path, leaving Trent to his crumbling reality. When I re-entered the grand dining hall, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The formal dinner service had concluded, and the wealthy guests were migrating toward the marble dance floor. I watched from the shadows as Trent made his reappearance. He strode back into the room with his arrogant swagger, pulling his suit jacket tight and flashing an empty smile. He grabbed Brooke by the waist, pulling her onto the dance floor. They twirled under the crystal chandeliers, the picture of absolute perfection. To the untrained eye, he was a confident billionaire celebrating his final night as a bachelor. But I knew the truth. I knew that beneath the silk and cologne he was sweating with the terror of a man who owed $4 million to absolute monsters. But knowing the truth and proving it to a brainwashed daughter are entirely different battles. Brooke had spent 2 years submersing herself in Trent's fantasy. She would not believe the word of a father she viewed as a bitter mechanic. If I confronted her with nothing but a story about an overheard call, she would immediately run to Trent. He would likely convince her to elope tonight, cutting me out of her life permanently to secure access to her trust fund. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed hard evidence that would shatter his illusion so completely that Brooke could not deny what was standing in front of her. I turned away from the dance floor and walked purposefully toward the grand foyer. I exited through the front doors, leaving the loud music behind me. The driveway was a circular expanse of crushed gravel lined with the most expensive luxury vehicles in the world. I stood on the top step, my eyes scanning the glittering sea of automotive engineering. I was looking for one specific vehicle. Earlier that evening, Trent had spent 20 minutes loudly bragging to older investors about his brand-new custom-ordered Porsche 911. Every single word he spoke was a meticulously crafted lie designed to blind the wealthy guests around him. He claimed it was a spontaneous purchase, a minor reward to himself for securing the Manhattan commercial acquisition. I spotted the sleek midnight black Porsche parked prominently near the front of the VIP line. I walked down the stone steps and approached the valet podium. A young attendant stepped forward to assist me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out another crisp $100 bill. I folded it neatly and slid it across the wooden podium. I told the young man that my future son-in-law had accidentally locked a very important wedding document inside his Porsche, and I needed 5 minutes alone with the vehicle to retrieve it. The valet glanced at the money, then at my serious, unyielding expression. He discreetly pocketed the bill, handed me the electronic key fob without saying a single word, and turned his back to attend to another guest. I walked over to the black Porsche and pressed the unlock button. The headlights flashed sharply in the dark. I pulled open the heavy door and leaned inside. To anyone else, it was the ultimate symbol of financial success. But my entire life had been built around engines and logistics. I know how to look past the shiny exterior. I slid into the low driver's seat and popped open the glove box. A man who truly owns a high-performance sports car keeps meticulous records. He keeps his registration insurance documents and service warranties neatly organized. The glove box was almost entirely empty, save for a single brightly colored manila folder. I pulled the folder out and turned on the overhead dome light. I opened the cover and began to read the documents inside. The logo at the top of the page did not belong to an exclusive dealership or a premium leasing agency. It belonged to a notoriously shady exotic car rental service located on the outskirts of the city. My eyes scanned the detailed rental agreement. Trent Caldwell had not purchased this car. He had not even leased it. He had rented it precisely by the hour. The contract clearly stipulated a strict 24-hour rental period beginning yesterday afternoon and ending tomorrow morning right before the wedding ceremony. He had paid an exorbitant, highly predatory interest rate just to have the car sitting in the valet lot for a single night, purely to maintain his fragile illusion of wealth. I folded the rental agreement and placed it carefully into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, but my instincts told me there was more to find. A man this desperate always leaves a chaotic trail of mistakes behind him. I began to search the rest of the cabin. As I leaned over to inspect the passenger side floorboard, my hand brushed against a crumpled, heavily creased piece of bright yellow paper shoved carelessly underneath the seat. I pulled the yellow paper out and smoothed the sharp creases against my knee. I held it up to the overhead light. It was a formal legal document stamped with the official seal of the City Housing Court. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Final Notice of Eviction." I read the details printed below. The document was addressed directly to Trent Caldwell. It listed a small, extremely modest apartment in a deeply undesirable neighborhood miles away from the affluent financial district he claimed to dominate. According to the court order, Trent was over 6 months behind on his basic rent payments. The landlord had successfully secured a legal judgment against him, and the city marshals were scheduled to forcibly remove his belongings and physically lock him out of the property by next Tuesday. I sat back in the leather seat, the sheer magnitude of his deception washing over me in a cold wave. Trent was not just broke, he was entirely destitute. The self-proclaimed billionaire hedge fund manager, the man who arrogantly mocked my boots, the man who claimed to be buying skyscrapers in Manhattan, was literally days away from being completely homeless. The expensive suit was likely rented. The champagne was being charged to a fraudulent tab he had no intention of paying. And his entire survival, his desperate plan to pay off violent creditors and avoid living on the streets, depended entirely on tricking my daughter into signing a marriage certificate tomorrow afternoon. I carefully folded the bright yellow eviction notice and placed it next to the rental agreement in my breast pocket. I turned off the dome light, stepped out of the rented Porsche, and locked the door behind me. I walked back to the valet podium, returned the key fob to the young attendant, and offered him a small nod of gratitude. The crisp night air felt suddenly electrifying. The heavy burden of uncertainty was completely gone, replaced by the cold, calculated precision of a father preparing for absolute war. Tomorrow, the grand illusion would finally shatter in front of everyone, and I would be the one holding the hammer to smash it into pieces. I walked slowly back up the wide stone steps of the estate. The cold night air had cleared my mind. Every step I took felt grounded. Inside the main hall, the party had reached a fever pitch. The loud, pulsing rhythm of modern dance music vibrated through the heavy wooden doors. I bypassed the crowded ballroom. I had no desire to watch these oblivious socialites worship a false idol. Instead, I navigated through a quiet, softly lit corridor, making my way toward the men's restroom. The heavy mahogany door was slightly ajar. As I pushed it open, the sound of the bass was instantly muted, replaced by the harsh, echoing sound of ragged, panicked breathing. I stepped inside silently, letting the door glide shut behind me. The restroom was a lavish display of marble and brass smelling sharply of citrus hand soap and Trent Caldwell's overwhelming designer cologne. Trent was standing alone at the far end of the long vanity counter. He had taken off his tuxedo jacket and tossed it carelessly onto the spotless floor. His silk tie was yanked loose, hanging crookedly around his neck. He was leaning heavily over the polished marble sink, gripping the brass edges so tightly that his knuckles were white. He turned the golden faucet on full blast and aggressively splashed freezing cold water directly onto his face. He gasped loudly, his shoulders heaving up and down as he fought to pull air into his terrified lungs. He was in the middle of a massive panic attack. The carefully constructed armor of the untouchable billionaire hedge fund manager had melted away, leaving behind nothing but a cornered animal. I stood still near the entrance, observing him with clinical detachment. He muttered desperate, broken curses, staring wildly at his dripping reflection in the wide vanity mirror. For a long moment, Trent was oblivious to my presence. He continued to hyperventilate, splashing cold water onto his pale skin, trying to shock his nervous system back into compliance. As he lifted his head to reach for a hand towel, his wild eyes darted across the mirror and caught my reflection standing right behind him. The transformation was instantaneous and pathetic. The raw terror on his face vanished in a split second, replaced by a sudden surge of manufactured rage. It was the aggressive overcompensation of a weak man who knows he has just been exposed. He spun around, water dripping heavily from his chin and soaking into the collar of his dress shirt. His chest puffed out, his eyes narrowing into a vicious glare. He took 2 fast steps toward me, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. "What are you doing sneaking around in here, you creepy old mechanic?" Trent spat, his voice shaking. "Are you stalking me now?" I kept my hands casually at my sides, my posture relaxed. "I am simply using the restroom, Trent," I replied smoothly, my voice devoid of emotion. "You look like you are struggling. Do you need me to call a doctor for you?" That simple factual observation broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. The humiliation of being seen in a pathetic state by a man he viewed as garbage pushed him over the edge. Trent lunged forward with a sudden burst of unearned arrogance. He grabbed the lapels of my suit with his wet hands and forcefully shoved me backward. My lower back hit the edge of the marble vanity with a dull thud. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to fight back. I stood there like a solid brick wall, unmoved by the frantic, shaking force of a terrified boy. Trent leaned in close, his face inches from mine. He smelled of expensive whiskey, stale fear, and nervous sweat. "Listen to me very closely, you pathetic old man," Trent hissed, spit flying from his lips as he tried to project authority. "I have been generous letting you sit in that dining hall tonight. I have tolerated your miserable presence because Brooke begged me to be a nice guy. But this is my world. You do not belong here. You are nothing but a dirty mechanic who failed his family. I want you to stay out of my way tomorrow. You sit in the back row, you keep your mouth shut, and you do not embarrass my beautiful bride with your disgusting poverty. If you ruin my perfect wedding, I will personally destroy what little life you have left. Do you understand me?" He pushed me hard against the marble sink one last time for emphasis, then abruptly let go of my lapels, stepping back as if touching my suit had physically disgusted him. He stood there panting, waiting for me to cower, apologize, or react with the submissive fear he desperately craved. I did none of those things. I simply looked at him, my expression entirely hollow. I slowly reached up and calmly adjusted the collar of my suit jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles his wet hands had left behind. The silence in the restroom stretched out heavy and uncomfortable. My total lack of intimidation terrified him far more than if I had thrown a punch. A predator recognizes a lesser animal instantly, and Trent knew deep down in his hollow core that his aggressive performance had completely failed. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. Without waiting for my response, Trent spun around and snatched his tuxedo jacket off the wet floor. He reached blindly into his back pocket to grab his thick leather wallet, intending to shove some loose cash inside it in a manic frenzy. His hands were shaking too violently to maintain basic coordination. As he aggressively shoved the leather wallet back toward the pocket of his tailored trousers, he missed the opening entirely. The heavy wallet caught the edge of the fabric, flipping awkwardly in his clumsy grip. He cursed under his breath, grabbing the wallet and shoving it deeply into his pocket on the second try. He turned sharply and stormed out of the restroom, slamming the heavy mahogany door violently behind him. The loud echo of the slamming door faded, leaving the lavish restroom in complete silence once again. I stood by the marble vanity, breathing in the quiet calm. I looked down at the exact spot where Trent had frantically fumbled with his expensive leather wallet just moments ago. Resting silently on the intricate geometric pattern of the tiled floor was a very small, rectangular slip of bright pink paper. It had fluttered completely unnoticed out of his overstuffed wallet during his panicked exit. I stepped forward and slowly bent down, picking up the small slip of paper between my calloused fingers. The heavy cardstock texture felt incredibly familiar. It was not a restaurant receipt or a business card. It was an official pawnshop transaction ticket. I flipped it over and read the faded black ink printed precisely across the front. The ticket clearly detailed the recent sale of a vintage, highly recognizable diamond necklace, pawned for a fraction of its true value just to desperately fund a cubic zirconia ring. It was the final piece of physical evidence. I held the small pink slip of paper up to the harsh fluorescent lighting of the marble vanity. My calloused thumb traced the faded ink, my mind racing to process the devastating information printed across the heavy cardstock. It was an official transaction record from a notoriously discreet pawnbroker located deep within the Diamond District. The date stamped on the top right corner was exactly 3 months ago. That was the very same week Trent had formally asked for my daughter's hand in marriage. I squinted at the detailed item description, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The receipt did not just list a generic piece of jewelry. It explicitly described the exact cut, clarity, and weight of a flawless 3-carat diamond. My breathing slowed as the devastating truth clicked into place. Trent had not purchased a custom ring to shower my daughter with luxury. He had taken the antique family heirloom ring that Brooke's late grandmother had entrusted to him for the proposal. He had ruthlessly ripped the priceless, flawless generational diamond right out of its antique platinum setting. He sold her precious family legacy for quick cash to save his own truly miserable life. To cover his tracks, he had a cheap piece of dull cubic zirconia mounted into her grandmother's original setting. He presented it to Brooke as a massive custom upgrade, preying entirely on her manufactured desire for high society validation. She wore the fake stone proudly, completely unaware that the real diamond, the very symbol of her family history, had been pawned off to a stranger. I read the final payout amount printed boldly at the bottom of the pink slip. It was a massive sum of liquid cash, enough to cover incredibly large, extremely urgent personal expenses immediately, without hesitation. My mind instantly connected the specific date on the pawnshop receipt to another crucial timeline. 3 months ago was the exact same week Patricia had proudly boasted about Trent securing this magnificent, highly exclusive coastal estate for the wedding weekend. She had gloated to anyone who would listen about how Trent had graciously paid the astronomical venue deposit entirely up front in cash. The puzzle was now completely solved. He did not use hedge fund profits to pay for this lavish rehearsal dinner. He used the stolen cash from Brooke's own family inheritance to temporarily fund his pathetic grand illusion. Brooke was standing on the precipice of an absolute disaster, enthusiastically preparing to marry a deeply dangerous, utterly desperate fraud. The man she believed was a billionaire was actually a penniless con artist actively running from violent street-level criminals. He was using her to survive, planning to drain her grandfather's massive trust fund the absolute second the wedding was legally finalized tomorrow. I folded the pink slip precisely in half and slid it securely into my breast pocket, alongside the rented Porsche documents and the legal eviction notice. I now possessed the complete, irrefutable blueprint of his dark deception. The overwhelming temptation to march directly onto the dance floor and publicly drag him out by his rented lapels surged through my veins. Every protective paternal instinct screamed at me to grab my daughter, expose the pink slip to the entire crowd, and tear his fake kingdom down immediately. But I forced my racing heart to slow down. I closed my eyes and took a deep, stabilizing breath in the quiet restroom. Acting purely on emotional impulse is how amateur men lose wars. A true apex predator understands the critical importance of perfect timing, undeniable leverage, and absolute overwhelming power. If I simply walked out there and told Brooke the truth right now, she would never believe me. She had been thoroughly brainwashed by Patricia's toxic materialism for years. To Brooke, I was nothing more than the poor, bitter dad who lived in a dusty trailer park, desperately trying to sabotage her glorious ascent into high society. She would look at the pawn receipt, and Trent would effortlessly invent another smooth, plausible lie. He would claim it was a complex investment strategy or a temporary business loan, and she would eagerly swallow every single word just to protect her fantasy. A simple piece of paper was not enough to break the deep spell he had cast over her. I needed to trap him in a public corner so tight that no amount of smooth talking could possibly save him. I needed to let him build his glorious pedestal as high as possible so the impending fall would shatter his facade permanently. The tension in my jaw finally released as my strategy crystallized. I could not fight this battle dressed as the forgotten mechanic. I needed to bring the full, terrifying weight of my actual financial empire crashing down upon him. I exited the quiet restroom and walked directly through the vibrant, laughing crowd of wealthy guests without saying a word to anyone. I did not stop to look at Brooke, who was still spinning blissfully on the polished marble dance floor in the arms of a complete monster. I did not acknowledge Patricia, who was aggressively waving her empty champagne flute at a passing waiter. I simply pushed open the heavy front doors and walked out into the cool, dark night. I approached the valet, requested my old battered pickup truck, and waited patiently in the damp, refreshing coastal breeze. When the young attendant brought my truck around, he gave me a sympathetic, slightly pitying look, completely unaware that he was handing the keys to a man who could buy this entire estate with a single phone call. I climbed into the torn driver's seat, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the familiar, comforting roar of the reliable engine. I pulled slowly out of the circular gravel driveway, leaving the bright, hollow mansion far behind me. The drive back to my modest rented motel room on the edge of town was silent, profoundly purposeful, and entirely focused. Once safely inside my quiet room, I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my duffel bag. This was the direct line I used only for coordinating high-level global logistics and massive corporate acquisitions. I dialed the private number of my chief legal counsel, a brilliant, absolutely ruthless attorney named Marcus. He answered on the second ring, fully accustomed to my late-night operational directives. I instructed him to immediately purchase the entire commercial debt portfolio of Trent Caldwell. I wanted every single loan, every outstanding marker, and every single legal obligation Trent had ever signed transferred to my name. Marcus did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply assured me that my sudden demand would be executed flawlessly before the sun rose over the eastern seaboard. I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the bedside table. I reached into my pocket, withdrawing the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. I laid the 3 pieces of paper side by side on the cheap mattress. Tomorrow, Brooke would walk down the aisle expecting a fairy tale. Instead, I was going to deliver a devastating, unstoppable hurricane of absolute, undeniable truth. Trent Caldwell was about to lose everything. The cheap motel walls were paper-thin, vibrating slightly calmly with the heavy sound of a passing semi-truck on the nearby highway. I stared at the 3 pieces of paper resting on the faded bedspread, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, and the eviction notice. Marcus was already working on the legitimate financial markets, acquiring whatever visible commercial debt Trent had foolishly accumulated. But the desperate, panicked conversation I had overheard in the garden required an entirely different approach. Commercial banks do not send thugs in cheap leather jackets to physically threaten their clients at formal wedding rehearsals. That kind of aggressive intimidation belonged strictly to the violent shadow economy. I needed absolute security for this next phase. I picked up my keys, stepped out of the dingy room, and walked back to my rusted F-150 parked under a flickering amber street lamp. The coastal air was heavily saturated with thick salt and damp fog. I climbed into the familiar driver's seat and firmly locked the heavy metal doors, completely sealing myself inside the quiet, insulated cabin. I reached down beneath the worn floor mats and popped open a hidden, reinforced steel compartment. I pulled out my primary encrypted satellite phone. This sophisticated device was completely untraceable, completely off the public grid, and reserved exclusively for the most critical high-stakes operations of my global empire. I dialed a specific, heavily encrypted international number. The secure line clicked and connected almost instantly. I was not calling Marcus this time. I was calling Vincent. Vincent was the ruthlessly efficient lead counsel and chief security fixer for the darkest, most aggressive branches of coal enterprises. He did not deal with corporate mergers or public relations. He handled the brutal realities of international leverage. Sir Vincent answered, his voice a low, steady gravel that commanded immediate respect. "Vincent," I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously cold, "I need you to run a level 1 background check on a man named Trent Caldwell, but do not look at his public financial records. Dig directly into the underground lenders operating in the tri-state area." "Consider it done," Vincent replied smoothly. "What exactly are we looking for tonight?" "Someone in the shadow market is holding a specific, highly volatile $4 million marker on him," I instructed. "It is due by Monday morning, and they are already sending physical collectors to intimidate him in public." "I want that debt, Vincent. I want you to locate the exact criminal syndicate holding his paper, and I want you to buy it entirely through our untraceable dummy corporations. Whatever the cartel or the loan sharks want for that marker, double it immediately in untraceable offshore funds. By sunrise tomorrow, I want to be the sole absolute owner of Trent Caldwell's entire life." "I will make the right connections immediately," Sir Vincent stated without a single ounce of hesitation. "I will have full legal ownership transferred to your primary blind trust before the traditional banks even open their doors." I ended the call and placed the heavy satellite phone on the empty passenger seat. I leaned my head back against the worn fabric of the headrest and stared out through the fogged windshield. The flickering street lamp cast long, distorted shadows across the empty parking lot. My mind was a calculating machine, processing the sheer magnitude of the trap I had just laid. For decades, Patricia had aggressively poisoned my daughter's mind with the toxic belief that true power was defined entirely by loud, ostentatious displays of immense wealth. She taught Brooke to blindly worship the shiny, empty shell of a man like Trent, while deeply despising the quiet, relentless labor that actually built the modern world. Trent was the ultimate tragic product of that shallow, greedy philosophy. He had spent his entire adult life desperately accumulating very expensive props. A fake diamond, a rented sports car, a fabricated hedge fund, all meticulously designed to project an absolute illusion of unquestionable dominance. But he had absolutely no structural foundation. He was a hollow, pathetic statue built entirely on fragile, rapidly crumbling sand. Real power does not need to boast loudly at a fancy dinner party. Real power does not need to publicly humiliate a working-class mechanic to feel significant. Real power is sitting silently in a rusted pickup truck in a deserted motel parking lot at 3 a.m, making a single untraceable phone call that completely buys a desperate man's life, his freedom, and his entire future. I closed my eyes and let the steady rhythm of my breathing calm my racing thoughts. The paternal anger was still there, burning like a massive furnace deep inside my chest, but it was entirely controlled. I was not acting out of petty vengeance. I was executing a necessary surgical strike to officially save my only daughter from a lifetime of absolute ruin. She would undoubtedly hate me for aggressively destroying her perfect fairy tale wedding. She would scream, she would cry, and she would probably try to banish me from her life forever. But a good father does not protect his child to win her immediate temporary approval. He actively protects her because it is his fundamental sacred duty regardless of the tremendous personal cost. The long hours ticked by incredibly slowly in the cold, silent truck cabin. I watched the thick coastal fog slowly begin to lift as the first faint gray light of a new dawn started to bleed gently into the eastern sky. My encrypted satellite phone suddenly vibrated against the passenger seat, immediately breaking the heavy, solemn silence of the morning. I picked it up and answered right away. "It is officially done," Sir Vincent reported, his voice remarkably crisp and purely professional. The underground syndicate, currently holding the $4 million marker, was surprisingly eager to liquidate the problematic debt. They knew Caldwell was a massive, unpredictable flight risk. We discreetly transferred exactly $8 million through the secondary offshore shell corporation. The official digital marker and all the highly damaging physical blackmail material they held against him are now legally and permanently in your exclusive, absolute possession. "Did they ask any questions about the mysterious buyer?" I asked continuously, watching the bright sunrise slowly illuminate the rusted hood of my old truck. "None at all," Vincent replied calmly. "They were just incredibly thrilled to magically double their risky criminal investment completely overnight. Trent Caldwell now personally owes you exactly $4 million payable immediately upon your direct demand. You have absolute, total financial leverage." "Thank you, Vincent," I said quietly. "Stand by for further instructions this afternoon." I ended the call and tucked the phone securely back into the hidden floor compartment. The absolute power I severely needed was finally secured. I stepped out of the heavy truck and walked back to my small motel room. I needed to meticulously prepare for the big wedding. I carefully laid out my old dated Sears suit. I polished my heavy steel-toed boots. I gathered the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, and the digital confirmation of his massive criminal debt. I folded them perfectly and placed them away. The morning sun broke through the coastal fog, casting a pale light through the curtains of my cheap motel room. I stood before the cracked mirror and buttoned my dated Sears suit. The fabric was stiff, a stark contrast to the custom Italian wool I normally wore. I pulled on my polished, steel-toed boots. I took the folded stack of devastating evidence, the pawn receipt, the rental agreement, the eviction notice, and the digital confirmation of Trent Caldwell's massive criminal debt, and secured them inside my inner breast pocket. They rested against my chest like a loaded weapon. I drove my rusted pickup truck toward the coastal estate. The grounds were already buzzing with chaotic energy when I arrived. Florists were frantically arranging towering displays of white roses. Caterers were shouting orders as they set up outdoor dining tents. I parked my truck near the service entrance, keeping myself entirely out of the way. I needed to remain completely invisible until the right moment. I had not been standing by the doors for 10 minutes when Patricia spotted me. She was marching across the lawn, clutching an expensive clipboard and barking loud orders into a silver earpiece. Her face was tight with the stress of projecting ultimate perfection. When her eyes locked onto me, her frantic energy instantly shifted into targeted malice. She ended her phone call and marched directly toward me. "Harrison, you are completely useless, standing around here like a lost vagrant," she snapped, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. The main delivery truck just arrived at the back gate with the bulk ice for the outdoor reception bars. The catering company is trying to charge us an extra $200 just to unload it. We absolutely cannot afford to waste extra money on basic labor when we are already paying a fortune for this very luxurious venue. Go to the loading dock right now and unload those 50 bags of ice. Try to make yourself somewhat useful for once in your miserable life." I looked at her angry face. A man who controls global shipping routes does not unload delivery trucks to save $200. A man building an inescapable trap plays his assigned role flawlessly. I did not argue. I did not defend my dignity. I lowered my head, offered a submissive nod, and walked toward the gravel loading dock at the rear of the estate. I needed Patricia and Trent to feel completely safe, entirely convinced that their cruel dominance over me was absolute. The refrigerated delivery truck was idling loudly near the back gates. The rear doors were thrown wide open, revealing massive pallets stacked high with bags of commercial ice. Each bag weighed 40 pounds. I rolled up the sleeves of my cheap suit jacket, exposing my weathered forearms. I reached into the freezing truck bed, grabbed the first bag, and hoisted it onto my right shoulder. The cold soaked through the thin fabric of my suit, sending a chill into my bones. I turned and began the grueling walk across the vast property toward the main reception tents. My 70-year muscles strained under the shifting weight. I focused on my breathing, falling into the steady rhythm of physical labor I had learned decades ago on the freezing shipping docks of New York Harbor. As I carried the fourth bag of ice across the courtyard, a loud burst of arrogant laughter echoed from the stone patio above me. Trent Caldwell had emerged from the main house surrounded by a tight group of 5 groomsmen. They were dressed in matching custom-tailored suits holding crystal glasses filled with expensive morning mimosas. They looked down at me from their elevated balcony, like ancient kings observing a lowly peasant. Trent pointed a manicured finger directly at me, a cruel mocking smile stretching across his freshly shaved face. "Look at this pathetic display, boys," Trent called out, making sure his voice was loud enough for me to hear. He leaned over the ornate stone railing, shaking his head in theatrical pity. "I told you we had our very own personal pack mule for the weekend." The groomsmen erupted into vicious laughter. One of them, a tall man with slicked-back hair, raised his glass in a mocking toast. "Keep moving, old man," he shouted down at me. "That expensive champagne is not going to chill itself. You better hurry up before you break a hip." I did not break my stride. I did not look up at the balcony. I kept my head bowed, playing the role of the broken, defeated father to absolute perfection. I let the freezing water drip down my neck and soak my collar. I hauled the 5th bag, then the 10th, then the 20th. My shoulders ached, and my calloused hands grew numb from the biting frost. The physical pain was intense, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the sharp, blazing focus burning deep inside my mind. Every time those arrogant boys laughed, every time Trent shouted another degrading insult from his comfortable perch, I felt a distinct, silent vibration deep inside the pocket of my trousers. My encrypted satellite phone was continuously buzzing against my leg. Vincent was sending me automated real-time tactical updates from the Cole Enterprises war room. Each silent vibration was a massive lethal strike against Trent's fake empire. Buzz, our dummy corporations had formally filed the absolute transfer of his $4 million criminal debt. Buzz. The underground syndicate had officially cleared the offshore payment, fully washing their hands of Trent Caldwell forever. Buzz, our aggressive legal team had successfully frozen all 3 of his primary bank accounts using the newly acquired leverage. Buzz. We had successfully flagged his fraudulent hedge fund operations to the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. The trap was not just closing, it was snapping shut with bone-crushing, inescapable force. I hoisted the 30th bag of ice onto my aching shoulder. I walked past the rose gardens, listening to the groomsmen continue their relentless mockery. They had no idea they were insulting the apex predator who now owned every single breath Trent took. I carried the 40th bag. Patricia walked past me, offering a smug smirk as she saw the dark sweat stains forming on my old suit. I picked up the 50th and final bag of ice. As I lifted the massive weight, my phone buzzed one last time. It was a long, sustained vibration. The final confirmation. Vincent had secured the ultimate kill switch. I carried the last bag to the outdoor bar and dropped it heavily into the stainless steel cooler. I stood up straight, stretching my stiff back. The labor was finished. The humiliating performance was entirely over. I rolled my damp sleeves down and buttoned my cheap jacket. The sun was fully up now, shining brightly over the massive estate. The wedding ceremony was less than 3 hours away. I looked up toward the stone balcony. Trent was still there, smiling arrogantly, completely oblivious to the fact that he was already a dead man walking. I turned and walked toward the guest seating area, absolutely ready to watch the entire world burn. I turned and walked toward the guest seating area, absolutely ready to watch the entire world burn. The sprawling coastal estate had fully transformed into a magnificent spectacle of high society excess. Massive floral arches made of pristine white roses and imported orchids framed the central aisle. The string quartet was already tuning their instruments in the shade of a massive oak tree, filling the morning air with soft, elegant classical music. Wealthy guests were beginning to arrive in droves, dressed in designer gowns and expensive tailored suits. They mingled casually on the manicured lawn, sipping delicate flutes of sparkling water and admiring the breathtaking ocean view. I stood near the back row of the seating arrangement, blending perfectly into the background in my cheap, damp suit. Patricia was fluttering through the crowd like a frantic general commanding an army. She greeted the elite guests with her practiced synthetic smile, ensuring everyone noticed the sheer scale of the luxury she had supposedly orchestrated. I saw my beautiful daughter Brooke briefly emerge onto the upper balcony of the main house. She was surrounded by a team of frantic bridesmaids and makeup artists. Even from a distance, I could see the radiant, genuine happiness beaming on her face. She looked down at the gathering crowd, completely captivated by the magnificent fairy tale unfolding around her. It broke my heart to see her so thoroughly deceived. She truly believed she was marrying a highly successful, profoundly generous man who would protect and cherish her for the rest of her life. She had absolutely no idea that she was willingly stepping into a devastating trap designed by a ruthless predator. I checked the heavy silver watch strapped to my wrist. It was exactly 30 minutes before the wedding ceremony was scheduled to officially begin. The atmosphere was vibrating with intense, joyous anticipation, but my focus was entirely locked on the strict tactical timeline Vincent had established. I quietly stepped away from the growing crowd of guests, slipping past the usher station and navigating down a narrow cobblestone path that hugged the perimeter of the grand estate. The path led directly toward the rear of the property, wrapping around the bustling catering tents and ending in a secluded shaded alleyway behind the primary service kitchen. The loud clatter of industrial pots and the frantic shouting of the catering staff faded slightly as I stepped into the deep shadows of the brick alleyway. It was a dark, quiet staging area hidden from the glittering perfection of the wedding venue. I stood completely still, waiting in the damp coastal air. Exactly 1 minute later, a sleek black sedan pulled silently up to the edge of the service gate. A man stepped out of the vehicle. He did not look like a typical delivery driver. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, wearing dark sunglasses and an earpiece. He moved with the highly efficient, calculated precision of a professional corporate security operative. He spotted me standing in the shadows and walked directly toward me without a single moment of hesitation. He stopped exactly 3 feet away and reached inside his tailored jacket. He did not say a word to me. He simply extended his hand, holding out a thick, heavy black leather folder. The smooth leather was stamped with a small, discreet silver crest belonging to Cole Enterprises. I reached out and took the folder from his firm grip. The operative gave me a single, respectful nod, turned on his heel, and walked briskly back to the waiting black sedan. The car reversed smoothly out of the service entrance and vanished down the coastal road, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet alleyway. I leaned my back against the cold brick wall of the service kitchen and took a slow, deep breath. I broke the wax seal holding the leather flap shut and opened the folder. The thick stack of documents inside represented the culmination of the aggressive nocturnal investigation. I expected to see the standard predatory loan agreements, the exorbitant interest rates, and the explicit threats of physical violence associated with the criminal underground. But as I flipped past the initial financial summaries and began reading the core contractual obligations, my blood instantly ran cold. The devastating reality of this deception was infinitely worse than I had ever imagined. Trent Caldwell had not merely borrowed $4 million to maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth. He had not simply signed his own name to a dangerous marker with a violent cartel. He had actively, maliciously committed high-level identity theft. I stared at the bold black ink printed across the central collateral agreement. There, in stark, undeniable print, was her full legal name. Right beneath it was her exact, highly confidential social security number, along with the highly sensitive routing details for her generational marital trust fund. Trent had meticulously forged her signature on the criminal syndicate primary collateral documents. He had deliberately used my innocent daughter as the sole financial guarantor for his massive illegal debt. If Trent defaulted on the $4 million payment, the violent syndicate was not going to break his legs. They were legally and forcefully authorized by those forged documents to completely drain that entire trust fund. He had essentially offered her up as a sacrificial lamb to save his own skin. The sheer sociopathic cruelty of his calculated plan was staggering. He had spent the last 2 years showering her with fake affection, buying fake diamonds, and renting expensive cars solely to gain enough access to her private financial records to execute this massive, devastating theft. A cold, absolute fury settled deep into my bones. The time for observation was completely over. I pulled my encrypted satellite phone from my pocket and dialed the private number. He answered immediately. "Vincent," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, hollow register. "I have the black folder. I have seen the collateral agreement." He forged her signature. He used her identity to secure the entire marker. "I saw it too," Sir Vincent replied smoothly. "The level of blatant fraud is truly exceptional. We have the complete digital trail proving he accessed her private financial files exactly 3 days before securing the illegal loan. The trap is perfectly sealed. Finalize the purchase immediately." I ordered, my eyes scanning the bustling courtyard just beyond the alley. "Transfer the absolute maximum amount of offshore funds right now. I do not care what it costs. Buy the debt. Execute the transfer. I want complete, unquestionable ownership of this entire situation." "The funds are transferring as we speak," Sir Vincent confirmed. "The cartel has officially released all claims. You are now the sole exclusive owner of all debt from Trent Caldwell, his fraudulent contracts, and his entire future. He is officially your property." I ended the call and placed the phone into my pocket. The heavy folder felt like a loaded weapon in my hands. The elaborate, deceitful game Trent had played was finally coming to a violent end. I stepped out of the dark alleyway and walked back toward the bright sunlight. It was officially time to attend the beautiful wedding ceremony of Brooke. The magnificent coastal wedding ceremony was a flawless, meticulously rehearsed theatrical performance. I sat silently in the very last row of the pristine white folding chairs, watching as my beautiful daughter pledged her eternal life to a man who was actively planning to completely destroy her. Brooke looked breathtaking in her custom gown, her face glowing with genuine joy as she recited her heartfelt vows. Trent played the role of the devoted, deeply emotional billionaire groom to absolute perfection. He held her hands gently, wiping away a single manufactured tear from his cheek, as he promised to protect her and provide for her forever. The wealthy guests seated in the front rows sighed and murmured in absolute admiration, completely captivated by the beautiful romantic spectacle. I did not shed a single tear. I just sat quietly in the back, feeling the heavy black leather folder resting securely against my chest. After the ceremony concluded, the guests seamlessly transitioned into the climate-controlled outdoor reception tents. The level of sheer luxury was staggering. Towering crystal chandeliers hung from the draped fabric ceilings, casting a warm, golden glow over the perfectly arranged dining tables. Waiters in white tuxedos circulated endlessly, carrying silver trays loaded with premium champagne and exotic food. I found my assigned seat at a small, dimly lit table tucked away in the furthest back corner of the grand tent, positioned right next to the swinging doors of the service kitchen. Patricia had explicitly placed me there to ensure I remained entirely invisible to her wealthy friends. It was the perfect vantage point for me to quietly observe the impending disaster. As the opulent evening progressed, Trent began to visibly unravel under the intoxicating weight of his own perceived success. He drank glass after glass of the most expensive vintage champagne available, deeply convinced that his fraudulent financial schemes were now entirely secure. He paraded around the dance floor with his groomsmen, slapping their backs and shouting boastful jokes. He firmly believed he had won the ultimate prize. He believed he had successfully secured the $4 million he desperately needed to pay off the violent criminal syndicate, while locking down a beautiful wife and gaining unrestricted legal access to her massive generational wealth. He felt completely untouchable. The dinner service eventually concluded, and the clinking of silver spoons against crystal glasses signaled the beginning of the wedding toasts. Trent enthusiastically grabbed the wireless microphone from the band leader and confidently strode to the absolute center of the polished marble dance floor. He began his groom speech with a series of smooth pleasantries, charming the crowd with highly rehearsed anecdotes and fake humility. He thanked Patricia profusely for her exceptional taste and endless support, completely ignoring the fact that his existence was currently funded by stolen money. He turned to Brooke, delivering a sickeningly sweet monologue about how she had entirely captured his heart. The crowd applauded warmly, but Trent was not satisfied with simple applause. He was drunk on expensive liquor and completely consumed by his own toxic ego. He needed to assert total, unquestionable dominance. As the clapping slowly faded, his calculating eyes began to scan the sea of faces in the crowded reception tent. I knew exactly who he was looking for. His gaze swept over the brightly lit tables near the front and pierced through the shadows, landing directly on me sitting in the back corner. The charming, handsome smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a cruel, deeply malicious sneer. The heavy microphone crackled slightly in his hand. He had decided that his perfect evening would not be completely fulfilling unless he publicly humiliated the man he viewed as absolute garbage. Trent turned his back and signaled for the catering staff to bring out the wedding cake. A towering 6-tier masterpiece covered in gold leaf and delicate sugar flowers was carefully rolled onto the dance floor. The guests murmured in appreciation. Trent took the large, ornate silver cake knife from the table. He did not ask Brooke to join him for the traditional cake-cutting ceremony. Instead, he aggressively sliced an oversized chunk of the rich vanilla cake and scooped it forcefully onto a small porcelain plate. He handed the silver knife back to a startled waiter. Holding the plate with the massive slice of cake in his right hand, Trent grasped the wireless microphone tightly in his left. He stepped away from the cake table and began to walk purposefully across the long, crowded ballroom, heading toward my dark corner. The entire reception tent grew incredibly quiet. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, nervous glances as they watched the groom march aggressively past their tables. The heavy bass of his expensive leather shoes echoed slightly on the wooden floorboards. Brooke stood frozen near the center of the room, her smile faltering as she watched her new husband storm toward the back of the tent. Patricia watched the scene with a cold smirk spreading across her face, clearly anticipating the cruel public spectacle. Trent finally reached my small table. He stopped just inches away from me, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes burning with intense, toxic hatred. I did not stand up. I did not break eye contact. I remained seated in my cheap suit, my hands resting calmly on my lap, projecting an aura of total stillness. Trent raised the microphone to his lips, his voice echoing loudly through the massive speaker system for every single guest to hear. "You know, I have been incredibly blessed tonight," Trent announced, his tone dripping with thick, poisonous sarcasm. "I am surrounded by so many successful, powerful, and truly important people. But we cannot forget those who are less fortunate. We absolutely must show charity to those who have completely failed in life." Before I could even register his next movement, Trent suddenly dropped the microphone onto the table. He grabbed the massive slice of frosting-covered wedding cake with his bare hand, lunged forward with aggressive force, and shoved it directly into my face. The heavy, sticky mass of vanilla cake and thick buttercream frosting smashed hard against my nose and cheeks, instantly blinding me and sliding messily down the front of my cheap, dated suit jacket. "Try some dessert, Beggar," Trent shouted aggressively, his voice raw with vicious, unhinged superiority. Let us not have people saying I let my pathetic father-in-law starve at my own wedding. The brutal, humiliating action sent a massive shockwave of pure energy through the reception tent. For one brief, terrifying second, the massive room was completely dead silent. Then Trent's rowdy group of groomsmen erupted into loud, cruel, echoing laughter. Their vicious amusement quickly spread. Patricia stood near the front, her smirk widening into absolute satisfaction. My daughter stayed completely silent, looking absolutely terrified, holding her hands tightly over her mouth in pure shock. I remained perfectly still, slowly wiping the heavy frosting from my eyes. The cold cream dripped onto the collar of my worn shirt, ruining the cheap fabric. I did not flinch, and I did not wipe it away. I stared directly into his arrogant eyes, completely silent, absolutely ready to finally unleash my power. The heavy cake slid down my cheek, landing with a soft thud on the pristine white tablecloth. The sticky sugar clung to my eyelashes and weighed down the collar of my cheap suit. I did not raise a hand to wipe it away. I just sat there, projecting a terrifying stillness that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the massive tent. Trent stood above me, his chest puffed out like a victorious conqueror, completely intoxicated by the sound of his groomsmen laughing at my expense. He held his arms out wide to his wealthy audience, soaking in the cruel adulation. Patricia leaned against a nearby table, her eyes glittering with malicious joy as she watched the poor mechanic finally put in his rightful place. My daughter remained frozen on the dance floor. Brooke looked as though the ground had suddenly given way beneath her feet. She was paralyzed by the sudden vicious cruelty displayed by the man she was supposed to marry in less than 24 hours. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Trent turned his back to me, raising his hands to command another round of applause for his pathetic ego trip. That was when the heavy booming sound of a chair violently scraping against the marble floor echoed through the silent room. The sharp noise cut through the fading laughter like a gunshot. From a highly exclusive VIP table situated near the front of the stage, a massive figure suddenly stood up. It was Richard Belmont. Richard was a legitimate, ruthless billionaire real estate mogul. He was one of the most powerful and influential developers on the entire eastern seaboard. Trent had clearly invited him to the wedding as a shiny prop, a desperate attempt to legitimize his own fake status by associating with actual titans of industry. Richard did not look amused by the spectacle. His face was flushed crimson, with absolute, unadulterated fury. He tossed his linen napkin onto his plate and began marching directly across the polished dance floor. The sheer physical presence of Richard Belmont commanded absolute attention. He was a large, imposing man who did not tolerate foolishness. The remaining murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The wedding band, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in the atmosphere, abruptly stopped playing their soft background music. The silence that fell over the reception tent was heavy and suffocating. Trent turned around, a confident, slightly confused smile plastering his face as he watched the billionaire approach. He clearly thought Richard was coming over to congratulate him, to join in the cruel joke against the poor, uneducated father of the bride. Trent even took a step forward, extending his hand in a desperate gesture of wealthy camaraderie. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Richard roared, ignoring Trent's outstretched hand and swatting it away as if batting a diseased insect. The sheer volume of his voice shook the crystal chandeliers hanging above us. His eyes were wide with a mixture of profound shock and deep burning anger. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at Trent's chest. "Do you have a literal death wish, you stupid, arrogant child?" Trent flinched violently, his confident smile shattering into a million pieces. The sudden, aggressive verbal assault from a man he deeply idolized physically staggered him. "Richard, I do not understand." Trent stammered, his voice dropping 2 octaves into a pathetic, wavering pitch. "It was just a harmless joke. He is just a mechanic." "A mechanic," Richard bellowed, his voice laced with venomous disbelief. He took another step forward, backing Trent up against my small table. "You truly are the most pathetic, oblivious fraud I have ever encountered in my entire life. That man sitting right there is Harrison Cole. He owns the commercial shipping ports you claim to import through. He owns the global logistics empire that controls half the freight on this coastline. And that massive commercial high-rise building in Manhattan that you spent the entire cocktail hour bragging about acquiring. He is the man who just bought it out in cash yesterday morning. The collective gasp that rippled through the reception tent was incredibly loud. 200 wealthy socialites, investors, and family members simultaneously inhaled in pure, unadulterated shock. The words hung in the cold air, completely destroying every single lie Trent Caldwell had ever told. The revelation hit the room like a tactical missile. Patricia dropped her crystal champagne flute. The expensive glass shattered against the marble floor, but she did not even blink. Her jaw hung completely slack, her face turning an incredibly pale, sickly shade of gray as her greedy eyes darted frantically between Richard and me. I kept my hands resting calmly on the table. I slowly reached for a folded white linen napkin. With deliberate, incredibly steady movements, I began to wipe the sticky vanilla frosting from my face. I wiped my eyes, my cheeks, and my chin, letting the stark reality of Richard Belmont's words slowly suffocate the groom. Trent looked as though his soul had just been violently ripped from his body. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified corpse. His arrogant shoulders slumped forward. His breathing turned into shallow, rapid gasps. The man who had just shoved cake into my face was currently experiencing a complete psychological collapse in front of 200 people. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The smug, untouchable hedge fund manager was completely dead. In his place stood a terrified little boy who suddenly realized he had just picked a fight with the legendary apex predator. He stared at the cheap, dated Sears suit I was wearing, finally understanding the terrifying depth of my deception. I had not come to this wedding as a poor, defeated mechanic. I had come disguised as prey to lure him into an inescapable cage. And he had walked right into it, eagerly locking the heavy steel door behind himself. Brooke took 2 shaky steps forward, her eyes wide with total confusion and dawning horror. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling in the quiet room. "Is that true? Are you Harrison Cole?" I placed the stained linen napkin carefully onto the table. I did not look at my daughter yet. My eyes were entirely fixed on the trembling, sweating fraud standing right in front of me. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floorboards. I stood up to my full height. Without the hunched posture of a beaten man, my physical presence shifted dramatically. I straightened my ruined collar and looked down at Trent. "Richard is entirely correct," I said very softly. The undeniable, absolute power in my steady voice made the heavy silence in the room deepen significantly. Trent stumbled backward, his weak knees practically buckling under the tremendous, crushing weight of his colossal self-inflicted failure. He opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic lie, but he had absolutely nowhere left to safely run or hide. The grand, extremely expensive illusion was finally completely shattered. I stepped gracefully away from the small table, leaving the ruined cake behind, entirely prepared to strike the final blow. I maintained my unbroken gaze, letting the heavy silence of the grand reception tent amplify the absolute terror radiating from Trent Caldwell. He had expected me to cower, to retreat into the shadows with frosting dripping from my collar. Instead, I reached for a fresh linen napkin resting on the edge of the table. With slow, methodical, and profoundly steady movements, I wiped the remaining sticky vanilla cake from my face. I discarded the soiled napkin, tossing it onto the floor at his expensive leather shoes. The murmurs of the wealthy guests had completely died away. Richard Belmont stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching with grim satisfaction. Patricia looked as though she was about to faint, her manicured hands clutching the edge of a chair for physical support. I stepped forward, closing the distance between me and the man who thought he had conquered my family. The pathetic illusion of the clueless, uneducated mechanic evaporated entirely. I stood tall, my shoulders squared, radiating the cold, hardened authority of a man who commanded an international empire. Trent instinctively took a clumsy step backward, his chest heaving as he finally recognized the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I reached inside the breast pocket of my damp, ruined suit jacket. My fingers closed around the thick, heavy black leather folder that Vincent had delivered to me in the alleyway just hours earlier. I pulled it out slowly, letting the silver crest of Cole Enterprises catch the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. Trent stared at the folder, his eyes wide with a sickening realization. He knew exactly what kind of documents required that level of corporate security. Without breaking eye contact, I raised the leather folder and tossed it directly at his chest. The heavy binding struck him hard against his sternum. He fumbled to catch it, but his hands were shaking too violently. The folder hit the marble dance floor, bursting open upon impact. A massive stack of highly confidential legal documents, bank statements, and printed background checks scattered widely across the polished surface. The stark, undeniable evidence of his entire fraudulent existence lay spread out for the entire world to see. "Your highly exclusive elite hedge fund is an absolute phantom, Trent," I stated, my voice echoing clearly and firmly across the silent room. "There are no Manhattan acquisitions. There are no international corporate mergers. Your entire operation is nothing but a legally registered limited liability company with exactly zero assets, zero legitimate clients, and absolutely no trading history. You have been living off a fabricated portfolio, using counterfeit bank statements to charm desperate investors and foolish socialites who were too blinded by your rented suits to verify your actual net worth." The guests in the front rows began to whisper urgently among themselves. A few men who had likely invested their own money with him turned pale, immediately reaching for their phones. Trent opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate a defense, but his throat was completely dry. He looked down at the scattered papers, realizing that every single lie he had carefully spun over the last 5 years was permanently documented right there on the floor. I turned my attention away from the trembling coward and looked directly at my daughter. Brooke was standing frozen on the edge of the dance floor, tears brimming in her beautiful eyes. Her hands were still clasped tightly over her mouth. "Brooke," I said, gently softening my voice to speak only to her. "I need you to take off that engagement ring right now, sweetheart." She lowered her trembling hands, looking down at the massive, sparkling stone on her finger. I continued, forcing the harsh reality into the open. "It is completely made of glass, Brooke. It is a worthless piece of polished cubic zirconia. 3 months ago, the exact same week he proposed to you, the man standing in front of you walked into a shady pawnbroker in the Diamond District. He took the priceless, flawless heirloom diamond that your late grandmother entrusted to him, and he ruthlessly ripped it out of its antique platinum setting. He pawned your family legacy for quick, desperate cash just to pay the venue deposit for this very wedding." Brooke let out a sharp, devastated gasp. She pulled the ring from her finger as if the metal had suddenly burned her skin. She stared at the fake stone, the betrayal washing over her face in a wave of profound heartbreak. She looked up at Trent, silently begging him to deny it, begging him to tell her it was a misunderstanding. But Trent could not even look her in the eye. He stared at the floor, his jaw trembling silently, confirming every single word I had just spoken. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical wail, finally comprehending that her grand social climb was entirely funded by cheap glass and stolen family heirlooms. She collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands. The entire room watched in absolute horror as the handsome, charming groom was systematically dismantled, exposed as nothing more than a pathetic, thieving parasite who had preyed upon the innocent trust of a young woman. I turned my focus back to Trent. It was time to deliver the final, crushing blow. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, invading his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. He was completely trapped, pinned between my towering presence and the gathered crowd of furious guests. "You did not just pawn a ring to survive," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low, gravelly whisper that carried a lethal edge. "You borrowed exactly $4 million from an incredibly violent syndicate connected to the Russian mob. You were desperate, and you were cowardly. So instead of using your own name, you committed malicious identity theft. You deliberately used my innocent daughter's highly confidential social security number as the primary collateral for your illegal marker. You legally authorized a cartel to completely drain her generational trust fund in the event of your inevitable default. Trent squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear of pure, unadulterated fear leaking down his pale cheek. His entire body was shaking violently. He knew that the penalty for stealing from those particular lenders was incredibly severe. But your desperate little game ends tonight. I continued my words, striking him like physical blows. As of 6 o'clock this morning, my global corporation aggressively intervened in the shadow market. We purchased that entire debt portfolio through our untraceable dummy corporations. You do not owe the Russian mob a single penny anymore, Trent. You owe me. Your entire pathetic life belongs to me now. I am the sole absolute owner of your $4 million marker, and I am officially calling in the entire loan right now. You have exactly 10 seconds to process this reality before I have my personal security team drag you out of this reception and hand you over directly to the federal authorities for massive financial fraud and felony identity theft. Run away like the miserable coward you truly are, Trent. Get out of my sight and never return to my family. Trent did not run. His legs completely gave out beneath him, unable to support the massive weight of his sudden and absolute destruction. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the dance floor, his expensive tailored trousers pooling awkwardly around his knees. The arrogant, untouchable groom who had just shoved cake into my face was entirely gone. In his place was a broken, sniveling fraud. He crawled forward across the polished stone, closing the short distance between us. His hands still sticky with the vanilla frosting he had used to humiliate me reached out desperately. He grabbed onto the scuffed leather of my steel-toed boots, clutching them as if they were his only lifeline in a raging storm. Tears streamed down his pale face, mixing with the sweat of his profound panic. "Please, Mr. Cole," Trent begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine that echoed terribly through the silent reception tent. "Please, I am begging you. I will do anything you want. I will work for you for the rest of my life. I will be your absolute slave. Just please do not destroy me. Do not let them take me away. I can fix this. I can make everything right." I looked down at the weeping man clinging to my worn boots. There was absolutely no pity in my heart, only a deep, profound disgust. This was the predator who had manipulated my daughter, pawned her grandmother's priceless heirloom, and casually offered her financial future to a violent criminal syndicate just to fund his pathetic illusions of grandeur. I slowly, deliberately pulled my boot back, forcing his grasping hands to slip off the worn leather. I took a step away from him, creating a physical boundary between my family and his toxic existence. "You cannot fix a foundation built entirely on malicious lies, Trent," I said coldly, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "You made your choices with absolute arrogance, entirely convinced you were the smartest person in the room. Now you will face the absolute consequences of those choices." I raised my right hand into the air. I did not need to shout. I simply snapped my fingers. The sharp, crisp sound cracked through the heavy silence of the grand tent like the breaking of a dry branch. Instantly, the heavy wooden doors at the main entrance of the reception hall swung wide open. The soft afternoon sunlight poured into the room, silhouetting the 5 figures marching aggressively down the central aisle. Leading the group was Vincent. He was dressed in his immaculate dark charcoal suit, his face set in a mask of total, uncompromising authority. Flanking him on both sides were 4 federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets, their badges prominently displayed on their belts. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted immediately, shrinking back against their decorated tables to clear a wide path for the approaching officers. The sheer, undeniable reality of federal law enforcement entering a billionaire wedding reception sent a wave of terrified murmurs through the elite guests. Vincent stopped exactly 2 feet away from where Trent was still kneeling on the marble floor. He looked at the broken groom with mild contempt before turning his respectful gaze entirely to me. "We have the warrants fully secured," Sir Vincent stated clearly, handing a thick stack of official judicial documents to the lead federal agent. "The offshore transfers are locked, and the identity theft charges have been formally filed with the federal prosecutor." I offered Vincent a single firm nod. Arrest him for aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, and extensive financial conspiracy. I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a finalized judgment. The two lead agents stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Trent by his expensive suit jacket and hauled him roughly to his feet. Trent thrashed wildly, his panic finally overriding his physical weakness. "No, wait, please, you cannot do this to me!" Trent screamed hysterically, his voice breaking as the cold steel handcuffs snapped loudly shut around his wrists. "Brooke, tell them. Tell your father to stop." But Brooke simply turned her face away, wrapping her arms around her own torso as tears of profound betrayal fell silently down her cheeks. The agents did not hesitate. They spun Trent around and began frog-marching him aggressively down the long central aisle of the reception tent. Trent kicked and wailed, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly across the polished marble. His desperate, humiliated screams echoed loudly through the beautiful floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers, providing a perfectly pathetic soundtrack to the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless silence as the groom was dragged out of his own spectacular wedding and shoved forcefully into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. As the heavy doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, a new kind of frantic energy erupted near the front tables. Patricia had finally recovered from her initial state of paralyzing shock. She watched the man who was supposed to guarantee her entry into high society get hauled away like a common street thief. Her greedy, calculating mind frantically processed the devastating shift in power. She realized in a matter of seconds that the poor, uneducated mechanic she had relentlessly mocked and tormented all weekend was actually a titan of industry with a net worth that completely dwarfed her wildest fantasies. She quickly smoothed down her expensive silk dress and pasted a sickeningly sweet, entirely synthetic smile onto her pale face. She practically sprinted across the dance floor, her heels clicking loudly as she rushed directly toward me. "Harrison, darling," Patricia gasped, her voice trembling with an atrocious attempt at warmth and affection. "My goodness, this is all just so overwhelming. Why on earth did you not tell us who you really were? We could have treated you so much better. We could have planned something truly magnificent for you. We are family, after all." I stared deeply into her wide, calculating eyes. I saw the pure, unadulterated greed swimming just beneath the surface of her pathetic smile. She did not care about the profound trauma her daughter had just endured. She did not care about the massive criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed our family. All she cared about was the vast fortune she suddenly believed she could somehow access. I did not smile back. I let the cold, unforgiving reality of the situation settle heavily between us. "You do not understand the true definition of family." "Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, resonant tone that completely erased her fake smile. "I gave you exactly what you asked for. I played the exact role you assigned to me because it was the only way to expose the absolute truth. You ask why I did not tell you about my wealth." I looked right through her, letting my disgust show plainly. "Because you only love a wallet, Patricia. You do not love a man. You never have. And you never will." I turned away from her stunned, pale face, stepping past the ruined wedding cake, and walked across the dance floor to finally comfort my weeping daughter. The massive reception tent, which only moments ago had been filled with the chaotic energy of 200 wealthy guests, was now rapidly emptying. The elite socialites and opportunistic investors were fleeing the scene of the scandal as quickly as their expensive shoes could carry them. They murmured in hushed, terrified voices, eager to distance themselves from the catastrophic collapse of Trent Caldwell. Waiters in white tuxedo shirts quietly backed through the swinging kitchen doors, abandoning their trays of expensive champagne and exotic appetizers. Patricia, realizing that her grand social charade had been completely obliterated, grabbed her designer handbag and practically ran toward the valet station. She did not even look back at her own daughter. Within a matter of minutes, the magnificent, breathtaking venue was completely abandoned. The string quartet had packed their instruments and vanished. The only sounds remaining were the gentle rustling of the coastal wind against the heavy canvas fabric of the tent and the soft rhythmic sound of quiet sobbing. I walked slowly across the polished marble dance floor, my steel-toed boots echoing softly in the vast empty space. The massive chandelier above cast a warm golden light over the absolute ruins of the reception. Brooke was sitting alone at a large empty dining table. Her beautiful white wedding gown pooled around her on the floor, a stark contrast to the devastating heartbreak written across her face. She was not crying because she had lost Trent. She was a highly intelligent young woman, and the brutal reality of his deception had already shattered whatever toxic illusion he had built around her. She was crying out of a profound, overwhelming sense of shame. She had watched him shove cake into my face. She had watched her mother degrade me all weekend. She had been completely blind to the monstrous predator standing right beside her, and she had allowed the man who truly loved her to be treated like absolute garbage. I pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. I did not care that my suit was still stained with vanilla frosting, or that my collar was completely ruined. I just looked at my daughter, waiting for her to find her voice. She slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red and swollen, filled with a deep, crushing sorrow that tore at my heart. She looked at me, really looked at me, seeing past the cheap clothes and the weathered hands for the first time in years. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling so badly she could barely form the words. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was so completely blind. I let them treat you like you were nothing. I was so caught up in the fantasy and the beautiful dresses and the grand venues that I did not even see what he truly was. I did not protect you. I should have stood up for you." I did not offer her a stern lecture. I did not remind her of the countless times I had gently tried to warn her about Trent and his superficial charm. The brutal reality of the situation had already taught her the hardest lesson of her life. Instead, I reached out and gently pulled her into a deep, incredibly warm embrace. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing freely as I held her tightly. I rested my chin against her hair, providing the solid, unwavering foundation she so desperately needed in that exact moment. "I never hid my money to hurt you, Brooke," I said softly, my voice calm and completely devoid of any anger or resentment. "I hid it because I wanted to protect you from men exactly like him. When people know you have massive wealth, they look at you differently. They stop seeing a beautiful, intelligent young woman, and they start seeing an open vault. They manufacture an entire personality just to gain access to your resources. I wanted you to build a life based on genuine connection, not financial exploitation. I wanted you to find someone who loved you for your heart, not for your generational trust fund. Trent was a predator, and predators are incredibly skilled at wearing the perfect camouflage. You were not stupid, sweetheart. You were just trusting. And he weaponized your beautiful, trusting nature against you." Brooke slowly pulled back from the embrace, wiping her tear-stained cheeks with the back of her hand. She looked down at the empty space on her ring finger, then reached into the small silk clutch resting on the table. She pulled out the massive, sparkling engagement ring that Trent had placed on her finger with so many empty promises. She stared at the polished glass stone, a look of profound disgust washing over her face. She reached out and placed the fake ring directly into the palm of my hand. "Take it," she whispered, her voice growing slightly stronger, filled with a new quiet resolve. "I do not ever want to look at it again." I closed my hand around the worthless piece of glass and slipped it into my pocket. I stood up and offered her my hand. "It is time to go home, Brooke," I said gently. "The illusion is completely over. It is time to step back into reality." She took my hand, lifting the heavy skirts of her custom designer gown, and stood up. Together we walked away from the empty tables, the shattered crystal glasses, and the ruined cake. We walked out of the grand fake palace that Trent had built with stolen money and forged signatures. The warm coastal sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant orange and purple glow across the sky. The manicured lawns were entirely deserted. We walked past the empty valet station and headed directly toward the rear service parking lot. My old rusted pickup truck was sitting exactly where I had parked it earlier that morning. It looked completely out of place against the backdrop of the massive stone estate, but to me it looked absolutely perfect. I opened the heavy passenger side door. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet evening air. Brooke climbed inside her expensive wedding dress, filling the worn, cracked vinyl seat. I closed her door securely, walked around the front of the rusted hood, and climbed into the driver's seat. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned it. The old, powerful V8 engine roared to life with a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the entire frame of the truck. In that quiet, deserted parking lot, the loud, unrefined mechanical roar sounded exactly like a triumphant victory cry. We pulled out of the service entrance and drove down the coastal highway, leaving the deceit, the fraud, and the shallow world of Patricia and Trent entirely behind us. The months that followed that explosive wedding day were a period of intense, necessary healing for my daughter. We spent a lot of time together simply sitting on the porch of my quiet home drinking coffee and rebuilding our relationship from the ground up. Without the toxic influence of Trent or the suffocating vanity of Patricia, Brooke finally began to rediscover her true self. She started working alongside me at Cole Enterprises, learning the actual mechanics of our global operations from the bottom up. She realized that true success was not found in rented sports cars or fake diamond rings. It was built through quiet dedication, unwavering integrity, and genuine hard work. She learned how to manage her trust fund responsibly, establishing strict legal boundaries to ensure she would never be vulnerable to another financial predator. As for Trent Caldwell, the federal justice system completely dismantled his entire existence. The evidence we provided was absolutely overwhelming. He faced multiple federal charges for massive wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and criminal conspiracy. The violent syndicate he had attempted to borrow from was also heavily investigated, leading to a massive crackdown on their illegal lending operations. Trent was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. There were no designer suits or expensive champagne in his new reality. He was finally forced to face the absolute undeniable consequences of his extreme arrogance. Patricia, humiliated by the entire public ordeal, quietly moved away to a different state, unable to face her former social circle after her complete financial and moral bankruptcy had been exposed to the world. If you are listening to this story right now, I want you to walk away with a profound, unshakable understanding of the world. Predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear custom-tailored suits, drive expensive cars, and say absolutely everything you want to hear. They prey on kindness. They manipulate trust. They use superficial charm to blind you to their true intentions. You must always protect your peace, your identity, and your resources. Never let anyone pressure you into rushing a commitment, and never ignore the quiet, persistent warnings of your own intuition. True value is not measured by the price tag on a venue or the size of a diamond. True value is measured by respect, honesty, and the willingness to stand by someone when the entire world falls apart. If you enjoyed this story and found value in the lessons we learned the hard way, please take a moment to interact with this video. Hit that like button right now to support this channel and help these important stories reach more people who might desperately need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any of our upcoming life stories, and please make sure to turn on your notifications. I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comments section below. Tell me exactly where you are watching this video from today, what time it is in your city, and what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Have you ever encountered someone who tried to manipulate you for their own financial gain? Sharing your experiences helps build a strong, supportive community where we can all learn and grow together. Your engagement means the absolute world to me. Thank you so sincerely for taking the time to listen, for offering your support, and for standing with me. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and I will see you in the next life story. With love and profound respect. The greatest deception in life isn't a fake smile or a rented sports car. It is the belief that wealth defines a person's worth. True power does not shout from the rooftops, nor does it demand a front-row seat at the table. It sits quietly in the back, watching, calculating, and protecting those it loves. Never judge a man by the dirt on his boots or the age of his suit, for the quietest men often hold the keys to the kingdom. Respect everyone, because arrogance will eventually dig a grave that your wallet cannot afford to fill. If this story showed you the true meaning of power and respect, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and if you've ever dealt with a fake, arrogant person. I read every comment. See you next time.